And our time spent together today, we already did intros and level setting. So Letitia will take us through the foundations of blogs and op-eds, and then you'll be able to see some success stories of educators and advocates who have published op-eds and blogs. We'll work together on brainstorming what that might look like for you and telling your story. And then we'll wrap up with some next steps and takeaways.
So before I pass it off to Letitia, I think a question all of you had is why write a blog or op-ed? Some of you might have had experience already writing blogs or op-eds, but as educators, as advocates, we know that teacher voice, especially when it comes to education policy and practice, your voice is an integral component of that. As they say, those closest to the problem are closest to the solution, and you are living day to day in the classroom, seeing what students are facing, what you as educators face. So your voice is integral in that. Y'all are the best spokespeople when it comes to issues and policies that affect you, your students, and equity in education. And writing a blog or op-ed is just another tool that you can keep in your toolkit for your advocacy purposes and increasing and amplifying your voice. So with that, I believe we are going to hand it off to our editorial director at EdTrust, Letitia, to share a little bit about the foundations of blogs and op-eds. And I'll make sure to put slides in the chat so you can follow along if you would like.
Hi, everybody. Like Andrea said, and I said earlier, I'm the editorial director at EdTrust. I've been a writer and editor for more than 20 years. So I've written a lot of blog posts and op-eds, and I've edited a ton of blog posts and op-eds over the course of my career, in addition to, writing original articles. And I even wrote a middle grade novel this year. So called Salsa Magic in stores wherever you buy your books. Shameless plug. But anyway, so yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about the foundations of blogs and op-eds and how to construct them. So a blog, just the etymology, it's actually short for weblog. When the internet's basically first, surfaced, it's a public website, and it's, regularly updated with content that is informal, conversational, anecdotal, and timely. There are multitudes of blogs for every topic. Seems like everybody has a blog these days. The typical, what I like to hit the sweet spot for length is about 300 to 900 words. Of course, that's flexible. Some people like to write a lot, or some people are daunted by that. So, I always like to say, less is more sometimes, and you don't have to, 300 words is enough. It's like 2 or 3 paragraphs. As long as you get your point across, it's totally fine. An op-ed is a little bit different. The etymology, it's not from opinion. It comes from the location of the page in newspapers, which is opposite the editorial page. And the op-ed is basically an opinion. You want to put forth a persuasive argument on a timely topical issue and have a strong personal viewpoint. And it's slightly different from a blog in that op-eds appear in print or online, but they're basically constructed in the same way. Usually most outlets won't accept anything that's over 800 words. Some will do 1,000 words, but you really have to be succinct. And depending on the news cycle, whether you're responding to, something that is in the news, or timely in that, let's say you read an article and you want to respond to that article, you might need to turn things around in 1 to 2 days. So I always like to start by saying, have people find your voice and your theme and your topic, and what do you even say, right? you know, the subject matter doesn't matter as long as you're interesting. The information that you're giving is valuable. Sometimes visuals help, you know, but if you're writing for outside publications, you don't need to really worry about. But the main point is to be brief. And there are 4 key components to a blog post, and you want to have a strong title, a detailed opening paragraph. You want your content to kind of be chunked out in paragraphs with headers, if possible, and you want to have a succinct, I don't know why I can't say that word today, conclusion, you know, to make your point across or have a call to action. So the actual human brain has less attention span than a goldfish. I think a goldfish has 10 seconds, and you know, when you're trying to grab people's attention, as you have about 3 to 8 seconds, and that's it. So you really have to start off strong. That's why I always say the first 2 sentences are your most important. You want to tell the main point of your blog or ask a thought-provoking question. The rest of the paragraph quickly provides the 5 W's and the H, which is a what, where, when, how, and why, to demonstrate the value of the blog, because you want them to keep reading, obviously. So that's why you need to put your most important content up top. Some people think, oh, well, I should wait till the bottom to really, you know, hit home and you know, make my point clear. Chances are they're not going to make it to the end. So you want to summarize all your findings succinctly, and you want to end with, you could ask like a leading question or provide a call to action. So you want kind of clickable titles. You know, people like to be kind of sucked in. I mean, you know, you don't want to provide clickbait. You always want to be honest in your titles, but there are kind of some tips and tricks in terms of people like numbers. So, you know, 3 ways to, you know, increase teacher diversity, you know, reasons to, you know, hire diverse teachers, something like that. Don't get too caught up in it, because chances are if you're writing for an outside publication, they will change your title or reject your title outright and just come up with something else, you know, that is more SEO friendly, you know, in Google. So, you know, it's fun to think about, but don't obsess over it. So this is kind of the blueprint of what a blog post would look like. You have the headline, of course. You know, you want to have an image that kind of, you know, goes with the opening text. You may have a subline, and then you have the main content. You want a call to action, another sub headline, and then you want to, you know, kind of wrap it up quickly. The lead sentence, it's spelled LEDE. It's an old editorial term. Is your first sentence, and you really want to tie your last sentence to your first sentence, if that makes sense. And you can see with the subheadlines, that's what I mean by chunk out your content. So on to op-eds. This is a fresh insight on a public issue. You know, maybe in your local paper, you may want to, you know, see if you can get something published. You know, it can critique ideas, actions, or policies. You don't want to attack people themselves. And it suggests solutions, examines an underlying idea or broader context. It should stimulate thinking or be heartwarming. And it should attract a wide readership with, you know, but friendly, in a friendly tone. So again, the lead is what's going to grab your attention, the reader's attention. That's your intro. The news hook is how you tie into the zeitgeist and makes your piece timely. So that could be something in the news, or maybe you have a dramatic anecdote from the classroom. You could reference pop culture. You could, you know, take a phrase and then, you know, flip it on its head, or use some humor to point out a contradiction, use an anniversary, something like, you know, Brown v. Board. You know, there could be a new study out that you want to incorporate, or you can just tell a personal anecdote as well. So the three things you need to ask yourself before putting pen to paper is why now, so what, and why me? So the why is, why is this timely? Why is this important? Why do you need your audience to know this? So what is the point? What are you trying to tell readers that is so important? And then why me is because you are the expert on what is happening in the classroom, what is happening with students, your experience as a teacher. So, you are the right person to be writing this blog post or op-ed. So if you think of yourselves as an expert in your field, that should give you the confidence to reach out to publications. So here's just a few examples of, local and state general interest publications. Like I said, your basic local newspapers, magazines, that sort of thing. There's also education trade publications like Education Week. And then you have education sites that basically feature blog posts. It's more like a amalgam of content and ideas. And I know firsthand because I used to write for them and I used to work with them a lot, they're always looking for new content. So, like I said, the op-ed is very similar to the blog post. It's just a matter of who you're targeting. If you're targeting your local paper, it's an op-ed. If you're targeting a content website, then it's going to be a blog post. So, again, you want to identify a news hook. You might want to make it timely and relevant. And this is probably more important in an op-ed because that's what's going to get your op-ed accepted. It could be a student anecdote or your own story to illustrate what your theme is and what the point is that you want to make. You want to make your point in 1 or 2 sentences, why you believe about this issue and why you need to change it. And then from there, you can kind of zoom out on your theme and then zero in on your main points and, use some evidence. You want some recommendations or solutions or ideas that support your theme. And then, you can also buttress against like whatever the dissenting opinion is, like where your opinion is more important, has more credence than another person's point of view or organization's point of view. Like I said, we don't want to point out people specifically. And then, to conclude it, you always want to bring things back to your lead, and you always want to wrap things up with some kind of call to action, whether it's the public or your local lawmakers, other teachers, parents, that sort of thing. So I think I'm handing it back over to Andrea because we have some other contributors here that have written for me, some of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'll let you
Before
take it.
I pass it off to you hearing from advocates that have written, I really quickly just, if you have any questions for Letitia, currently, feel free to put it in the Q&A chat, or you can come off mute. I know that was rapid speed, and that was kind of just like the basics of what a blog and op-ed structure looks like, but she does have several years of expertise, and want to make sure that while she's here, she can answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, if you have any questions now, I'm happy to stay on till the end if you think of something afterwards. So yeah, hit me up.
Thanks, Letitia. So where do I start? That was a lot of information. And like Letitia said, as an educator, your experiences matter. And you just want to anchor your theme and topic in your expertise and anchor your passion as well as an educator. And we have featured a few ed trusters here who have had their pieces published, whether on the blog, or whether, you know, pitching op-eds themselves in their local community or in their state publications as well. And we actually have one advocate and former teacher that is here to kind of share a little bit about her experience. So we're going to move on to hearing from success stories, what makes a compelling written piece. So we have our Director of Advocacy and Engagement for EdTrust Tennessee. And I know there's Tennessee representation here today. Some of you might know her. Maylee Powell will share a little bit about her background and kind of share her experience with writing these pieces linked, and I'll make sure to put them in the chat. I believe she's published op-eds in different roles and in different capacities, but she's always brought it back to her time as an educator as well. So I will give her the floor.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Nice to see you all. So Andrea will share some of the pieces in the chat, but just, Andrea, do you want me to just work through the questions you sent me? Okay, great. So just a quick background about myself. I'm currently the Assistant Director of Advocacy and Engagement at EdTrust Tennessee, where I support our statewide coalition work. But previously, so I've been in Tennessee for about 7 years, grew up in Seattle, but I started my career as an educator, elementary reading teacher in Memphis. So part of the pieces that you'll see is when I was still in Memphis, doing local work there. So I worked as an elementary school teacher for 3 years, a literacy coach for 1, and throughout that time did some advocacy work with Stand for Children, which is how I started to get involved in op-ed writing. As while I was teaching, I'm sure as many of you on this call, I love teaching, the relationship building of part of it, but I also saw a lot of symptoms of inequity that I witnessed in the classroom. And when I started my fellowship with Stand for Children, I started to kind of connect those local or those symptoms of inequity to potential policy levers that could be shifted. So I started to get involved with local fund, we call it the Fund Student First campaign. And that was kind of my first experience with op-ed writing. So the first 2, I think Andrea dropped both of them here in the chat. So for all of them, for the question around how do you identify what to write about and where to place it, when I hopped on the call, I think centering it back to, you know, your students and your experience in the classroom is essential. So for all of them, I asked, you know, what's the timing of the issue? Will it get attention by the media? But also what's the ask or action item that helps prompt how people can engage with it. So that first article around the commercial appeal, this was a youth education funding campaign, and the opportunity was to inform the budget that Shelby County was promoting for students. The second one was a new policy decision made by our local school board around what was being called a new 3rd grade commitment, which was kind of a retention policy, but I was actually teaching 3rd grade at the moment. So the connection to that was I saw the potential negative implications of retaining students without additional supports. And then the third example here around, I wrote a piece, this is in my current role, statewide, around the increased censorship legislation across the state. So this kind of issue was really connected because Tennessee was recently in the news around having the most censorship legislation. But there was also recent news that we were falling behind on our social studies, like national scores. And the ask for that was that I was working on the Know Your Rights training. So it was kind of an action that people could take after reading the op-ed. The fourth question that Andrea sent me, I'm just working through your questions. So happy to pause. I know it's a lot. So if you have any specific questions, but how did your experience inform your writing? I think I centered, you know, all my writing experiences based off of what I was witnessing or had witnessed in the classroom. For example, on my piece around funding advocacy, a point I made in that op-ed was that Memphis, I called out that Memphis was investing less than 1% of its $700 million budget on education. So I talked about, you know, how my students needed individualized attention, but as I'm sure of many of you on this call, like we had a nurse that came in once a week. We didn't have a full-time counselor or a social worker. So really kind of connecting to what I was seeing in the classroom to what the ask or the policy issue was. On my piece around censorship legislation, I talked about how, like, when I was in the classroom, I didn't have to worry about censorship legislation, but also as a past social studies teacher, I created a narrative around, you know, my students were the most engaged when they saw themselves in materials and reflected in the world, and talked about a specific student who I remember relating to Ruby Bridges, and that story is actually under attack by some of our legislation. So again, being able to connect to, like, what's the policy issue, but how did that connect to my time in the classroom and real impact that it's having on students? And then the last question that Andrea sent me was, what tips do I have for educators who are just starting the writing project? The first one I had was, educators are closest to the solution. So just again, thinking about the narratives from your classroom, what have you learned from your students, from your families, and how does that relate to an issue that you care about? So going back to that one around censorship, like, I think about my time as a first grade teacher, and how much my students really loved, you know, the diverse curriculum we had, and how that was potentially being censored by these new pieces of legislation. A second one is, a hook is always important. I think that was on the last slide. You'll notice at the top of two of my pieces, I directly say that, you know, from my experience as an educator, I think it's always good to kind of show how you're connected to the issue at the top so that people know, like, who this voice is coming from. And also think that it's important to be full circle. So, like, at your conclusion, draw it back to your hook and how it impacts students in the classroom. And throughout it, you can see in the op-ed structure, there's also headline statements. So again, whether those kind of bolded facts or key statements that you want, if people were just to skim your op-ed, like, what do you want them to take away from it? The third piece of advice I wrote is backup experience with research or data. So the piece I wrote on the third grade commitment pulled some data about how in Shelby County schools, 3 out of 4 of our third graders were not reading on grade level. So pulled that statistic, and also less than 27% were proficient on the state test. But then I looped it back to my experience as an educator and said, you know, I've seen the impact of this because many of my students entered the year behind. So again, here's the data, but also how it connects to what I was witnessing in the classroom. And the last 2 things I had here was being solutions oriented. So I think it's really easy to write an op-ed around all of the issues that we're seeing in the classroom, but going back to the point that educators are closest to solution, also thinking about, like, what are the steps that you hope to be true to solve it? So, like, at the end of the piece that I wrote on the third grade commitment, I wrote about why I thought there was potential negative implications if you were to invest or retain students without additional investment. But I also wrote at the end, like, I thought, here's what I think a real third grade commitment would be. And so talked about, like, additional, you know, true universal pre-K, additional, like, social emotional supports for students. So trying to also think about, like, what's the solution that you hope to be true for students. And then my very last thought here is just to remember that you're the expert. I think with a lot of local and state level policies, I know that when I was a teacher, that seemed very overwhelming and it was a lot to think about. But, you know, in my seat today, working at the state level in Nashville, engage with a lot of legislators that have never been in a classroom or have meaningfully talked to, you know, folks on the ground that are most connected to these issues. So just know that your voice matters when you're writing these op-eds. And I hope that, that gives you just, like, you know, what you're doing right now brings you expertise that a lot of folks across your state right now might not have because they're not directly engaging with students every day like you are.
See, this is why I invited Maylee to come talk to y'all. So I want to give some time if you do have a question for either Letitia or Maylee to feel free to come off mute. I did have a question in the chat, and I think both you, Maylee, and Letitia can speak to it. But Daniel asked, do you have any hints on building relationships or asking newspapers to print your ideas?
I can start. I think the first time that I presented an op-ed was working with a local organization that had connections to the paper there. So I think it could be beneficial to, you know, if there's local education focused organizations, you know, making connections there, saying that you're a teacher interested in X issue in their work. And oftentimes, you know, they'll have those relationships that they could potentially connect you with. But I do know that I've also like submitted pieces before to just kind of cold email them. Like I know Chalkbeat has kind of that first narrative opportunity as well. Letitia, I don't know if you have anything else to add there.
Yeah, I mean, building relationships is kind of tricky in the beginning, because you know, in many cases you are essentially cold calling. You know, a lot of websites or you know, websites of papers and blogs, you know, will have a contact us form, you know, that says, you know, if you have a story idea, you know, let us know. So, you know, you kind of have to, you know, keep your fingers crossed that an editor will get back to you. You know, and any type of introduction is always helpful. If you happen to know of anybody, you know, who interfaces with an editor, that can be helpful. But yeah, I would just really get to know the outlet in which you're trying to get a placement in. Look at the masthead on the newspaper section to see, you know, who these editors are and how you might be able to contact them or make a connection with them. Like I said, blogs will usually have a contact us form. So, I mean, you know, just dive in really, you know, and just see what you can, you know, catch in your net.
I'll plus one to what they both said, and I can also share like my experience. Like I transitioned kind of from the classroom to, you know, a communications role. So building relationships with outlets, reporters, editors was very new to me, but you know, it is all about kind of just shooting your shot, setting up coffee chats, kind of the same way you might do with like parents and, you know, people in your school community. If you're involved with any organizations, like Maylee said, that might have a relationship with reporters, that might be a good in. When I was doing community organizing, we had a good relationship with like one specific local outlet, and that was kind of our way of, you know, publishing press releases and kind of getting some pieces published there. But just kind of, you know, reaching out yourself, whether it's that specific reporter, editor, and just kind of sharing that you'd like to share more about your experience. I know there are sometimes, like Letitia said, certain publications that have opinion sections specifically, or certain sections specifically for teacher voices. And I think we'll share a few of those today, a little bit later. But yes, agree with what they both said. And I do appreciate y'all's time, both Maylee and Letitia. Feel free to stay on. But just want to give a shout out to both of you for sharing your expertise and your knowledge with everyone here today. Any other questions that you would like to come off mute for or put in the chat?
I have a question for our writers before they leave. So I've done a couple of blogs with some research that I've done for a specific math curriculum. But I'd like to hear your thoughts around writing things for sources that could be potentially controversial, or where you take a really strong position on, and how that might impact your personal or professional career. Like, what advice or guidance do you have around sort of the getting over the fact of, well, if I publish this and it wreaks havoc, it could cost me a lot of stuff. And so how do you sort of navigate that space?
I'll go first. I will say that your reputation is the most important asset that you have, and you know, you want to do your best, you know, to maintain that and not have it tarnished in any way. I think there are ways to present a controversial topic without being controversial yourself, if that makes any sense. You know, again, putting the onus on maybe like the system itself and not not like the superintendent or something like that. I think that's how you can kind of skirt the issue a little bit. But like I said, you want to be able to keep your reputation, basically. And, especially since you're in the classroom and, all it takes is, one parent to, that could, start a domino effect. So that's how I would approach it.
Yeah, just echoing Letitia, I agree. So when I wrote the Tennessean article around censorship laws growing in Tennessee, advice that I got from my director at Trust Tennessee was to not put blame on, it would be easy to, put blame on the governor or the Republican supermajority that we have, but rather than focusing on, who is writing these laws, which definitely you could write a piece that way, it was more switched to like, what's the impact of those laws. So like I pull up the piece to give a specific example, but like talking about censorship as the issue. So, deepens oppression or threatening resources. When multicultural stories are omitted, students of color are the most harmed. So again, talking about the impact of the issues without putting blame could, to Letitia's point, make it less controversial. But also think totally respect on your reputation is super important. So something I've also seen done is like collective writing of op-eds. So like if you didn't want to put your name on it, writing through an organization, but also, just being transparent with who you're working with as well. So like, having support from if you wanted to talk with someone at your school. But again, I know that people's situations look different depending on the seat that you're writing in. But I've seen some of those approaches as well.
Thank you.
Leaving some time for any other questions you might have. Okay. I want to move on to our brainstorm session. Unfortunately, we thought that the current Zoom format was going to let us go into breakout rooms. That doesn't seem to be the case, but we will make sure to fix that for the next few sessions. But we can go ahead and take kind of like 10 minutes collectively to draft some ideas, brainstorm down. We can bounce off ideas off each other, ask questions if we need it. But I'm going to put a template in the chat. Choose a template of your choosing. Similar to what Letitia presented on, there's a template for a blog and a template for an op-ed that you can draft on. You just need to create a copy from this Google Doc link and pick an issue that you would want to speak to related to your personal experience or something you're very passionate about. I know when we've met with some of you are very passionate about literacy. Some of you are passionate about, the funding laws that are being passed in your state. So whatever issue is top of mind for you, go ahead and start brainstorming on potential formatting, title, and begin ideating. I'm happy to put a timer and have our experts here to answer any questions, but here are some questions to guide you. Who is your audience and what do they value? Every publication is going to be different. Every audience is going to be different. So if you want your audience to be policymakers, if you want your audience to be maybe just a general state audience, is it local? What do they value? What story do you want to tell and what main message do you want to get across? And just make sure that when you are doing the body middle portion to making your main points, but also having evidence or research that supports it, kind of what Maylee shared, pulling out a distinct kind of either data point or, research that really highlights how this is an issue. And finally, always ending with a call to action. So I'll put about 10 minutes. Feel free to ideate out loud. Keep those 10 minutes to yourself if you just want to brainstorm. but I hope you stay on for after the brainstorm session because we're going to share a little bit, share some additional resources you can use and take back with you, and potential next steps that we could provide for you. So I'll put 10 minutes, probably play some music in the background, but feel free to come off mute if you have questions. Okay, so before we share maybe some of you brave souls to share some ideas you might have drafted, I do want to share some examples of places that do take teacher-authored blogs and op-eds. So for blogs, I listed a few, but there's usually sometimes a ton of organizations that might take guest blogs, but specific education organizations that do are We Are Teachers, the Educators Room, Edutopia, Cult of Pedagogy, and EdSurge. And then for op-eds, it depends on who your audience is. If you're looking for a more local audience, just checking with your community city publications who might be reporting on education to see if they have an opinion section. Similar with state audience, there are sometimes state publications on education that have an opinion section, and they just tell you usually the word limit. Sometimes it varies, and then give you a space that you can enter it and submit it through there. There's actually some specific publications that have education labs. I know Seattle Times is one of them. I think there are a few more out there that are education specific. So great way to have your teacher voice and story shared through there. And just, if you are looking for a national publication, not just looking at trade publications like, the usual Education Week, the 74, Hechinger Report, K through 12 Dive, EdSource. Those are, big education outlets that most of us might be familiar with, but also trying non-trade publications. So it could be Teen Vogue, Essence. Sometimes there are good opinion pieces there that are timely, especially when it comes to the news cycle and what's going on. HuffPost, The Grio, Word in Black, Washington Post, New York Times, USA Today. Those are some of the bigger non-trade publications that you could look for that all have opinion sections. And we can go to sharing. So I do want to take a minute to kind of get a group poll feedback and thoughts before we wrap up. And we'll wrap up, share reflections, and share resources as well. But I believe there's a poll. Maybe not. So I think it's best, we'll just send you those 3 questions in a survey then. We just wanted to get feedback and thoughts on how we can kind of shape these webinars to be a little bit either more resourceful or beneficial for you. Other things we could have touched on that you would like support with, we'll make sure to include that in a follow-up survey. But to wrap up and next steps, would love just a few share outs or what are some takeaways you'd like to share with the group, whether it's an idea, a brainstorm that you're leaving here today with, whether it's like a started draft, maybe it's something new you've learned, and next steps that you want to take.
Did you want us to share out or?
Yeah, feel free to share reflections. It could be in the chat also.
The chat is showing up as disabled, but I can just share. I think something that was very helpful for me is having the templates kind of made it the idea of writing an op-ed seem less daunting. And as I worked through it, it was helpful to be able to plug in my ideas. And so I'm definitely the template just was a really helpful tool to kind of help me flesh out my ideas and organize them.
Thank you.
A takeaway for me, when we were doing that brainstorming, I was looking at our current legislation, and as I often do when I'm looking at our current legislative session, get really angry. I think the formats that you all provided were really good about being solution oriented, and I liked the point at which you just said, talk about how it would actually affect your classroom rather than maybe tip your hand at how you really feel about it. So I appreciated that a lot. Thank you.
I know we are at time, so if you have more feedback or have a question on how to get started with the idea you've already brainstormed, you can always schedule a one-on-one with one of us to talk more about op-eds and blogs and where to go next. We have a lot of great resources for you that will be provided in an email along with a review of this webinar if you want to go back and look at it, the slideshow, the great templates that Andrea shared, places where you can get your blog or op-ed published. So we are not just leaving you hanging. There's even more than what we covered here to help you along the way to get your voice out there and share your experiences in the classroom and in schools.
Yeah. Appreciate you all for taking the time. I know it's not easy, making time outside of just the regular work hours since you're already working at a school. But really excited to see you all want to engage and advocate for your students in different ways. It's inspiring to us, and I hope we continue seeing pieces published by teachers like you all, passionate about this work and wanting to serve, students of color. I do want to point out our next training session will be a month from now, a little bit over, February 26th. This one's going to touch on crafting effective messaging to reach your target audience. So it's kind of similar to here, but being more intentional with how to craft your talking points, whether you're, going to the Hill and, providing a testimonial, whether that's whether you're writing a letter to the editor. So we'll touch on different advocacy tools outside of just blog and op-ed writing in this training. And for now, you can follow us on socials on all platforms. Grace, you'd be happy that we're plugging in all of our socials here. Also, we'll have a registration link that we'll put in the chat. All of these resources, the slides, the recording, the resources that we didn't really get to talk through all too much, is going to be sent in an email to you all either tonight or first thing tomorrow morning. And yeah, we're just happy to be in community with you all, get to kind of share our love for teaching and students. So thank you all for being here. If you want to stay on because you have additional questions, feel free. We'll stay on maybe like 2 or 3, 5 minutes after. At least I will. But thank you all so much. And hopefully we see you in February.